Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere loud, smoky, and deeply delusional. 1950s Las Vegas. Not the Vegas of celebrity residences and $14 water bottles. I mean the real Las Vegas. The one with carpet patterns that could cause a seizure. Buffets that were genuinely trying to kill you. And a city built in the middle of the Mojave Desert by men who apparently looked at 115 degrees of direct sun and said, "You know what? Casino." Before you get comfortable, I just want to take a genuine moment to thank whoever suggested this topic. You know who you are, and honestly, this one is a gift. I read every single comment, and the ideas you all send in are the reason this channel exists and keeps growing. It means more than you know, so if you enjoy what I put together here tonight, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy it. No pressure, no guilt trip, just a quiet tap of appreciation if this is your kind of thing. And leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. It's almost always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I find that deeply comforting. Also, the channel is now live on Spotify, so if you'd rather drift off there, the link is in the description. Go find it. Tell it I said hello. Now. Dim those lights. Turn on a fan if you have one. Pull your blanket up. Get your pillow situated so it's actually comfortable, not just comfortable-ish, and let's ease into tonight together. But let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered what it was actually like to live in Las Vegas in the 1950s? Not to visit, not to gamble away your paycheck and drive home in shame, but to live there, to wake up every morning in the desert, 5 miles from a nuclear test site and think this is fine, this is home. Did the casino workers ever sleep? Did anyone own a house that wasn't made of dust and optimism? What did people eat when they weren't at a buffet? Was there a buffer for breakfast? Was everything a buffet? Could you actually hear yourself think over the sound of slot machines at 9 a.m, or did your brain just eventually give up and join them? What was it like to raise a child in a city that legally operated around the clock? Did kids in Las Vegas have bedtimes? Did anyone in Las Vegas have a bedtime? And what exactly happened when a nuclear bomb went off 40 miles away and the casinos just kept going? Congratulations. You've just woken up in Las Vegas, Nevada. The year is 1953. There's already a cocktail waitress walking past your window. It is 6 a.m. The neon is still on. The neon is always on. And somewhere in the distance a faint rumble rolls across the desert that may or may not be an atomic test. Welcome to the most surreal city in American history. Try not to squint. Let's talk about waking up. Not in a hotel, not as a tourist with a hangover and a vague memory of the craps table, but as an actual resident. Someone who lived here, in a real house, with a real alarm clock, in a real neighborhood carved out of the Mojave Desert, like someone lost a bet with God. Your morning in 1950s. Las Vegas started early, because the desert did not care about your schedule. By 7 a.m, the sun was already up and already mean. Not the gentle, golden, good morning kind of sunrise you see in movies. The Las Vegas sunrise was the kind that came in sideways through your Venetian blinds like it was trying to find something it lost. You would blink awake, feel the dry heat already settling into the room, and have a brief, honest moment of questioning every decision that had led you to this particular patch of sand. The first thing you noticed every single morning was the dryness. Not the pleasant, breezy dry of a nice autumn day. The aggressive architectural dryness of a place that received 4 inches of rain per year and was not particularly sorry about it. Your lips were cracked. Your sinuses felt like they had been lightly toasted. If you had a glass of water on your nightstand and you had learned, eventually, to always have a glass of water on your nightstand, it was already slightly warm, because the night in Las Vegas was rarely as cool as you hoped it would be. The desert gave back heat slowly, reluctantly, like a man who borrowed money and kept finding reasons why right now wasn't a great time. You got dressed in the particular way of desert residents everywhere, with a weariness that was less emotional and more practical. light colours, loose fabric, as little of it as socially acceptable. If you were a man heading to work at a casino, you put on a suit anyway because the casinos expected it, and you would spend your shift in a building cold enough to hang meat, so the outdoor temperature was almost irrelevant once you got there. If you were a housewife, you put on a house dress and immediately began calculating how much of what needed doing today could be done before 10 in the morning, because after 10 in the morning the heat would make doing anything feel like a moral failing. Breakfast was modest and practical. The grand buffets were a casino amenity, not a home institution. At home, in your small ranch-style kitchen, with the linoleum floor and the electric stove, breakfast was eggs, toast, coffee, orange juice from a can of frozen concentrate that you mixed with water in a pitcher in the refrigerator. The same breakfast being made in kitchens across America that same morning, except that yours was in the desert, and if you looked out your kitchen window, past the gravel yard and the chain-link fence, you could see the spring mountains to the west, blue and remote, and if the timing was right and the wind was coming from the right direction, you might hear, very faintly, the low mechanical sound of the city that never stopped, slot machines and traffic and air conditioning units running constantly. 24 hours a day, the background hum of a place that had decided sleep was optional. You finished your coffee, you rinsed your cup, you looked at the clock. It was 7:45 in the morning, which in 1950s Las Vegas meant that the night shift at the casinos had about 2 more hours to go, that the breakfast buffet at the Sands was already running, and that somewhere on the strip someone was still sitting at a blackjack table who'd been there since the previous afternoon and had simply not yet found a good moment to stop. You stepped outside. The heat arrived immediately without apology or transition, like a door opened into a furnace. You squinted. You got in your car. The steering wheel was already warm. The seat was already warm. The air coming through the window as you started to drive was warm and dry and faintly mineral-smelling. The particular scent of the Mojave in the morning, which is difficult to describe except to say it smelled like distance. And you drove off into your ordinary, extraordinary, utterly improbable Las Vegas day. Here is the thing about Las Vegas in the 1950s that nobody tells you. Most people who lived there were not gamblers. They were teachers, electricians, plumbers, housewives, government workers. They bought small ranch-style houses in neighborhoods with cheerful names like Paradise Palms and Sunrise Manor, and they lived utterly ordinary lives about 4 miles from the most extraordinary square mile in the country. If you were a regular Las Vegas resident, your neighborhood looked like any other American suburb of the era, except the yards were made of gravel instead of grass, because nobody had figured out how to keep grass alive in the desert yet without spending a truly alarming amount of money on water, and the mountains in the background occasionally had a faint glow on the horizon that was best not to think about too carefully. The houses themselves were small, sensible, and built fast, because the city was growing at a speed that made urban planners nervous. Between 1950 and 1960, Las Vegas's population nearly tripled. That kind of growth doesn't produce elegant architecture. It produces 3-bedroom tract homes with flat roofs, carports instead of garages, and interiors where the walls were thin enough that you knew your neighbour's entire schedule without ever speaking to him. They went up quickly, these houses, in subdivisions that were sold directly to young families who had come to Las Vegas for a job and stayed because the jobs kept coming, and the cost of living was, compared to California, almost reasonable. Your street was probably unpaved, or had been paved recently enough that the asphalt still softened slightly on the hottest summer afternoons. The neighbourhood had a few trees, stubborn, dusty things, planted by optimistic homeowners and kept alive by conscientious watering, and no sidewalks in many areas, because Las Vegas in the 1950s was a city designed entirely around the automobile. You drove to the grocery store, you drove to church, you drove to the school. Walking anywhere in that heat for any meaningful distance was something you did only if your car had broken down and you were regretting a series of life choices. The neighbours were a specific and interesting mix. On one side of you might be an electrician who worked construction, building the new casinos going up along the strip. On the other, a woman whose husband dealt cards at the Desert Inn on the swing shift and slept until noon. So the neighbourhood had an unspoken agreement not to run lawnmowers before 1 in the afternoon. Down the street, a family whose father worked at the Nevada test site. He couldn't tell you exactly what he did there, and you had learned not to ask. Next to them, a retired couple from Iowa who had moved west for the dry air and stayed because the winters were mild and the cost of a house was something they could actually comprehend. The social life of a Las Vegas neighborhood in the 1950s was backyard barbecues and church on Sunday morning and the women's auxiliary at the school and little league games on dusty fields where the wind came up in the third inning and blew red grit into everyone's eyes. It was Tupperware parties and card nights and children running through sprinklers in the front yard on summer evenings after the sun had dropped low enough to make being outside survivable again. It was, in other words, a completely normal American suburban life, being lived completely normally in one of the most abnormal places on the continent. The residents of Las Vegas's neighborhoods in the 1950s had performed a remarkable mental trick. They had made the extraordinary ordinary. The neon was just the lights on the horizon. The casino workers were just the neighbors. The nuclear tests were just the rumbling. You heard sometimes when the wind was right. You got used to it. You had to get used to it. Because it was home. And home, wherever it is, eventually just becomes the place where you keep your things and know which floorboard creaks. Let's talk about the heat. Because in 1950s Las Vegas, the heat was not a weather event. It was a relationship. A deeply personal, deeply unpleasant, completely inescapable relationship with the sun that the sun was clearly more invested in than you were. Modern Las Vegas is heavily air-conditioned to the point of being almost cold. You walk from a 110-degree parking lot into a casino that is 68 degrees, and your body simply accepts this as normal. But in the early 1950s, widespread residential air conditioning was still a novelty, a luxury, an aspiration, something your neighbour had and you were quietly furious about. Most houses had what was called a swamp cooler, which is exactly what it sounds like. It was a box on the roof filled with wet pads that blew damp, vaguely mineral-smelling air through your house, and made everything feel slightly like you were living inside a moist towel. It worked fine when the humidity was low. In Las Vegas, the humidity was usually low, but fine is doing a lot of work in that sentence. By 1955 or so, refrigerated air conditioning was becoming more common in Las Vegas homes, but it was expensive to install and expensive to run, and many families in the earlier part of the decade were simply doing without it and coping through a combination of strategy, stubbornness, and what can only be described as the kind of willful psychological adaptation that humans deploy when they have no other options. You learned the rhythm of the desert heat the way sailors learn tides. Morning was manageable. By 10, it was serious. By noon, it was an argument. By 2 in the afternoon in July, stepping outside felt like opening an oven door. Except the oven was everywhere and there was no turning it off. You adapted your entire life around this. Housework was done in the morning. Shopping was done in the morning. Any errand requiring movement through outdoor air was done in the morning. By midday you were inside, blinds drawn, a glass of something cold nearby, a fan oscillating slowly in the corner while you waited for the sun to begin its retreat. Children were sent outside to play in the early morning and again in the early evening, with the middle of the day as a kind of enforced indoor interlude that every child in Las Vegas understood and every child in Las Vegas resented equally. The cars were miserable. There was no air conditioning in most cars in the early part of the decade car air conditioning existed, but it was rare and expensive and consumed so much engine power that many people didn't bother. You drove with the windows down, which in Las Vegas in summer meant you were essentially driving inside a convection oven with the ventilation set to aggressive. The steering wheel was too hot to grip comfortably. The seats scalded the backs of your legs if you were wearing shorts. The upholstery smelled faintly of baked vinyl in a way that is very specific to hot cars in very hot climates and is extremely difficult to find appealing. And then there was the phenomenon known locally as a haboob, though most residents at the time would have simply called it dust storm, a wall of brown grit rolling in off the desert, blotting out the mountains and sometimes the entire sky, coating every surface in a fine red-tan layer of Mojave floor. After a dust storm, you cleaned. You cleaned the counters and the window ledges and the car and the patio furniture and the insides of your shoes, because the dust had gotten into all of those things with remarkable thoroughness. And then, a week later, there was another dust storm, and you cleaned again. People who grew up in Las Vegas in the 1950s speak about the heat with a particular kind of fond resignation, the way you talk, about a difficult relative who was also occasionally magnificent. The sunsets were extraordinary. The winter evenings were cool and clear and smelled like sage. The sky at night was enormous and full of stars in a way that is genuinely hard to find anywhere near a city anymore. None of that made July comfortable, but it made the rest of it most of the time worth it. If you worked on the Las Vegas Strip in the 1950s, your office was one of the strangest places in America. The casinos of that era, the Flamingo, the Desert Inn, the Sands, the Sahara, were not the gleaming towers of today. They were low, wide, sprawling buildings with parking lots full of enormous American cars and lobbies, full of cigarette smoke so thick you could feel it as a physical presence, like walking through a very glamorous fog. Working in a casino meant working hours that made no human sense. The Strip operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and it needed bodies at every hour to run it. If you were a dealer, a pit boss, a cocktail waitress, a keno runner, or any of the dozens of other jobs that kept the machine turning, your schedule was whatever the casino decided it was, and the casino had no particular feelings about your circadian rhythm. The shift structure at most major casinos in the 1950s ran in 3 8-hour blocks: the day shift, the swing shift, and the graveyard shift. The graveyard shift, midnight to 8 in the morning, was considered the least desirable by most workers, but it paid slightly better and had a particular atmosphere all its own. The people who came into a casino at 3 in the morning were a different species from the afternoon crowd. They were serious gamblers, insomniacs, night workers from other industries, and people who had simply been there since the previous afternoon and had not yet located the exit. Dealing cards to them in the small hours required a specific kind of patience that was not teachable exactly. It was more like a disposition, a quality you either had or slowly developed after enough graveyard shifts. Getting to work was its own minor adventure. The Strip was not always well served by public transportation, and many casino workers drove in from the residential neighbourhoods to the east and north. The parking lots at the casinos had a staff section, usually less glamorous than the guest section, and considerably further from the door, and you walked in through an employee entrance and went through a process that was surprisingly formal for what amounted to punching in at a very unusual office. You were checked for proper uniform. You were briefed on any procedural changes. You were told which tables or stations you'd be working, and then you went out onto the floor, and the noise and the light and the particular intensity of a busy casino floor closed around you like water, and your shift began. The money, for the time and the place, was reasonably good. Dealers at top Strip properties earned wages that, combined with tips called tokes in the industry, and pooled among the dealers at many properties, put them firmly in the middle class. The casino work was, in that sense, one of the better-paying working-class jobs available in 1950s Las Vegas. which is part of why the city attracted workers from across the southwest. A dealer who had good hands, a pleasant manner with guests, and the specific ability to be simultaneously friendly, efficient and unreadable, had a genuinely viable career. Some of them stayed for decades. What you did not talk about at work or elsewhere was the ownership. The Flamingo had been Bugsy Siegel's project before his murder in 1947. The Desert Inn was Modalitz's operation. Various other properties had their own complicated financial genealogies, involving investment from people whose business interests in other cities had not always been entirely legal. Everyone who worked on the Strip understood this at some level. It was simply not a thing you discussed. You showed up, you did your job, you collected your pay, and you kept your observations about the organizational structure of your employer very firmly to yourself. This was not considered unusual. It was just how it was. The carpet was loud, the smoke was thick, the money was real, and certain questions were simply not asked. Casino dealers in 1950s Las Vegas were a special category of human being, subject to rules so specific and so strange that they bordered on the ceremonial. You were not allowed to touch your face. You were not allowed to put your hands in your pockets, which was fine because your uniform had no pockets, by design, because the casino wanted to make absolutely sure you were not slipping chips into them. When you finished your shift at a table, you were required to clap your hands together clearly, show both palms to the cameras above, and then turn them over. This was called clearing your hands. You did it every single time you left a game so that anyone watching could confirm your hands were empty. Imagine ending every shift at your job by performing a small, formal magic trick to prove you had not stolen anything. That was Tuesday for a Las Vegas dealer in 1954. The training required to become a dealer was serious business. The dealing schools of the era taught you to handle cards with a precision that would have seemed eccentric in any other context. You learned to pitch cards across felt with a flat, controlled snap that landed them exactly where they needed to go. You learned to shuffle in specific ways, the riffle, the strip, the box, each one designed to be both effective and visually transparent so that a watching supervisor could confirm the shuffle was genuine. You learned to count chips by touch, to run your hand across a stack and know its value without counting piece by piece. These were skills that took weeks to acquire and months to become genuinely smooth at, and the casinos expected you to have them before you ever stood behind a live table. Your table had a rhythm to it, and managing that rhythm was the real job. You dealt to anywhere from 1 to 7 players depending on the game and the time of day, and you were responsible for keeping things moving, not so fast that players felt rushed, not so slow that the house lost money to inefficiency. You were responsible for catching errors, including your own. If you miscounted a payout and gave a player too much, that came out of your hide eventually. If you miscounted and gave a player too little, they were usually going to notice and object, sometimes loudly, and you would need to handle that with a particular diplomatic skill of someone who is simultaneously apologizing and not admitting fault and not making the pit boss come over. The pit bosses watched everything. They stood behind the tables in dark suits, arms folded or hands clasped behind their backs, eyes moving constantly across the floor. Their job was to watch for cheating, to watch for dealer mistakes, to watch for players who were counting cards, to watch for players who seemed to be working in teams, and to watch for anything else that looked even slightly irregular. They communicated with a vocabulary of small, precise gestures, understood by everyone on the floor and no one in the seats. A slight nod, a 2-finger tap on the felt, a hand raised briefly in a specific direction. The floor of a 1950s Las Vegas casino was, in its own way, an extraordinarily sophisticated communication system operating entirely in silence within earshot of the customers. What you never ever did was take a bet on your own behalf. You never had an interest in the outcome of a hand. You did not gamble at the casino where you worked, not on the floor, and not in any way that could be construed as using your position for advantage. The casinos were extraordinarily strict about this, and for good reason. A dealer with a financial interest in the outcome of a game was a security risk so obvious it didn't require much imagination. The irony was that many dealers, after years of watching people lose money at the games they ran, were among the least enthusiastic gamblers in Las Vegas. They had watched the house edge operate at close range, day after shift after year, and they understood it in their bones. The math was the math, and the math, over time, always won. The cocktail waitresses of 1950s Las Vegas occupied a peculiar and fascinating role in the social ecosystem of the Strip. They were essential to the entire operation. The casinos gave away free alcohol to gamblers, and someone had to carry it across miles of carpet in heels. But they were also, paradoxically, subject to an almost militaristic set of rules about how they looked, moved, and behaved at all times. The costumes alone were an engineering achievement. Depending on the casino's theme, a cocktail waitress might be dressed as a showgirl light, a cowgirl, a Roman goddess, or simply a woman in a very tight uniform with a very wide tray. They wore heels, always heels, on carpet that was designed specifically to be disorienting, low lighting, loud patterns, no clocks. They walked miles every shift carrying drinks to people who had absolutely no idea what time it was. The free drink policy was one of the more ingenious inventions of early Las Vegas casino management. The logic was beautifully simple. Alcohol loosens the relationship between a person and their money. A gambler who's comfortable and slightly warm from two complimentary cocktails is a gambler who is less likely to carefully calculate their losses and walk away. So the drinks were free, they were delivered constantly, and the cocktail waitress was the delivery mechanism. She was also, not incidentally, a reason for a gambler to stay at his machine or his table rather than wandering away to find a drink himself. You didn't have to move to get a drink in a Las Vegas casino. The drink came to you. The casino had thought of everything. Getting the job in the first place was not straightforward. The major casinos were explicit about the physical requirements for cocktail waitress positions in a way that would be spectacularly illegal today, and was, even by the standards of the 1950s, fairly aggressive. You needed to be young. You needed to be a specific height, not too tall, not too short, calibrated to the dimensions of the uniform and the tray. You needed to meet appearance standards that were stated plainly and without apology in the hiring process. Some casinos required regular weigh-ins for their waitresses to ensure that employees maintained the weight they were hired at. This was not considered unusual. It was simply the job. Once hired, you learned the floor. The casino floor in the 1950s was not a simple room. It was an enormous, deliberately confusing space, designed so that guests would lose their sense of direction and find it difficult to locate the exit. You, as a cocktail waitress, had to know exactly where everything was in this intentionally disorienting environment. Remember the drink orders of everyone in your section without writing them down at many properties. Navigate your way through crowds of gamblers and spectators with a tray full of glassware, and do all of this while remaining pleasant, attractive, and available for the occasional inappropriate comment that you were expected to deflect with a smile and no escalation. The tips were the income, the hourly wage was modest. What made the job financially viable was the gratuity from gamblers who were either winning, in which case they were generous, or losing, in which case they were sometimes oddly generous as well. People in the process of losing money often developed an expansive attitude toward money in general, a kind of why not, it's all going anyway philosophy that benefited the cocktail waitress as much as anyone. The best shifts were Friday and Saturday evenings when the floor was full and the tips were good. The worst shifts were slow, weekday afternoons when the floor was quiet and you walked miles for very little return. And then your shift ended, your heels came off, your feet reminded you that they had their own opinions about the evening, and you went home to wherever in the city you lived, in the residential neighbourhoods 4 miles from the neon, where the alarm would go off the next morning and the whole improbable thing would begin again. If the cocktail waitresses were the working backbone of the strip, the showgirls were its heartbeat, or at least its most photogenic organ. The showgirl shows of 1950s Las Vegas were something genuinely unlike anything else in American entertainment. These were not burlesque acts or strip shows. They were elaborate, expensive theatrical productions, with live orchestras, detailed choreography, enormous costumes, and feathered headdresses that weighed more than a small child. A showgirl working the strip in the 1950s was an athlete who happened to be covered in rhinestones. The headdresses could run to 25 or 35 pounds. The costumes were built around the performer's body like wearable architecture, and they performed in them for 2, sometimes 3 shows a night, 6 nights a week, in venues that were not air-conditioned to any meaningful degree backstage. The distinction between a showgirl and a showgirl dancer was important, and the people involved were very clear about it. The showgirl, technically speaking, was the woman who wore the large costume and walked, stood, and posed on the stage. Her role was aesthetic, presentational. She was a moving piece of scenery, and there was no condescension intended in that description, because being a moving piece of scenery in a 30-pound headdress, while maintaining perfect posture and a composed expression for 45 minutes, requires a specific physical competence that most people could not replicate. The showgirl dancer was the one who actually danced. The high kicks, the turns, the choreographed sequences. Both roles required training, but different training. Getting hired as a showgirl meant passing a physical audition process that was extremely specific about height. The major shows required their performers to be within a narrow range, generally between 5'6" and 5'10", because the costumes were designed to fit those dimensions, and because the visual effect of a chorus line depended on a consistency that left very little room for variation. You also needed to be able to move well enough that a heavy headdress didn't visibly alter your carriage. Many women found that it took months to build the neck and shoulder strength necessary to make a 30-pound headdress look like nothing at all. The backstage world of a Las Vegas showroom in the 1950s was cramped, loud, and run with a discipline that the audience never saw. The dressing rooms were small and shared, lit by the kind of bare bulb mirrors associated with theatrical spaces everywhere. Costume maintenance was constant. The rhinestones fell off, the feathers shed, the structural elements of elaborate headpieces required regular rebuilding. There were wardrobe staff whose entire job was the maintenance and repair of costumes that cost more than most people's cars. The shows themselves were directed and choreographed by professionals who came out of Broadway and Hollywood, and they ran those rehearsals with a precision that left no room for lateness, inattention, or attitude. The pay was reasonable for the era and the work, but it was not extravagant, and the career had natural limits. The shows employed young women, and as those women aged, the producers replaced them with younger ones. This was understood by everyone, involved as simply the nature of the work, in the way that athletes understand their careers have time horizons. Many of the women who danced on the strip in the 1950s went on to marry, to teach dance, to work in other parts of the entertainment industry. A few became choreographers or production staff. Most of them, if you ask, will tell you that the work was exhausting, that the headdresses were genuinely brutal, that the audiences were appreciative, and that there was something about performing in a room full of people who were having the time of their lives that was, despite everything, genuinely wonderful. Here is the thing about the mob in 1950s Las Vegas that people who lived there will tell you, if you ask carefully, everyone knew. It was not a secret exactly. It was more of a shared understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that sat in the background of daily life, like the hum of the slot machines. Constant, unremarked upon, structuring everything. The major casinos of the era were, to varying degrees, built and operated with money that had travelled a long and complicated road before it arrived in Nevada. Figures like Bugsy Siegel, Mo Dalitz, and later Benny Binion were not shadowy underworld phantoms. They were civic figures. They showed up at charity events. Their names were in the newspaper. Their wives were at the same cocktail parties as the mayor. If you were a local in Las Vegas in 1953, you might have your car fixed by a mechanic who did work for the Flamingo, bought groceries from a store whose owner had a handshake deal with the Desert Inn, and attended a school fundraiser partly underwritten by people whose income streams were genuinely best not examined too closely. The relationship between the mob and Las Vegas in the 1950s was not primarily one of violence or intimidation, at least not toward regular citizens. For the average Las Vegas resident, the presence of organized crime as a background fact of local commerce was mostly irrelevant to daily life. Nobody was shaking down the school teacher or leaning on the electrician. The mob's interest in Las Vegas was financial, not territorial in the street gang sense. They had found a place where gambling was legal, where cash moved in enormous volumes, where the regulatory environment was thin and the opportunity was extraordinary. They ran the businesses, they employed the locals, they built the infrastructure of a city that would not otherwise have had any. The skim was the thing that federal investigators were most concerned about, and for good reason. In a cash-heavy casino operation, the money counted in the counting room, and the money that actually came off the floor were not always the same number. Cash could be removed before the official count, skimmed, and sent off to investors in other cities who had provided funding for the casino's construction and expected returns that were not going to appear in any official ledger. This was happening at various casinos more or less continuously throughout the 1950s and into the 60s, and everyone in the industry knew it was happening, and the Nevada Gaming Commission, which had only been established in 1955, was in the process of slowly, imperfectly figuring out what its actual authority was and how to use it. For the workers, the dealers, the pit bosses, the cocktail waitresses, the maintenance staff, the mob ownership of their employer was simply a structural fact, like the building being made of concrete instead of wood. You did not think about it consciously. You showed up. You did your job. You were paid. The man in the expensive suit who occasionally walked through the floor and nodded at the pit boss was not someone you looked at directly or asked questions about. This was not fear, exactly. At least not for most people. It was more like the practical social intelligence that comes from living in a place long enough to understand which conversations are useful and which ones are not. The FBI was watching. The Kefauver Committee had held its hearings in the early part of the decade, televised to a fascinated national audience, naming names and connecting the dots between Las Vegas casino financing and organized crime figures across the country. The federal government was alarmed. Nevada more or less shrugged. The casinos were generating tax revenue. People were employed. The city was growing. The arrangement, from Nevada's perspective, was working, and the question of who exactly owned the arrangement was one they were prepared to engage with slowly, carefully, and with a strong preference for not disrupting the economy in the meantime. Between 1951 and 1962, the United States government detonated over 100 nuclear weapons at the Nevada test site, located approximately 65 miles northwest of Las Vegas. This is not a sentence that gets easier to sit with the longer you look at it. The tests were visible from the city. On certain mornings, Las Vegas residents would set their alarm clocks early, drive to a high point on the edge of town, and watch the mushroom cloud rise over the desert in the pale pre-dawn light. Some casinos hosted atomic viewing parties on their rooftops. Hotels advertised rooms with good test-watching views. The local newspaper published the test schedule so residents could plan accordingly. The Miss Atomic Bomb Beauty Queen was crowned in 1955, and photographs of her still exist. A young woman in a swimsuit with a mushroom cloud pinned to her chest like a corsage, smiling at the camera in a way that somehow perfectly captures the entire 1950s attitude toward nuclear weapons, which was essentially, well, what are you going to do? The Atomic Energy Commission, which ran the test site, was at pains to reassure the population of southern Nevada that everything was completely fine. They distributed pamphlets. They sent representatives to speak at community meetings. They used language that was, in retrospect, performing a considerable amount of work, words like negligible and acceptable levels and no cause for concern, which covered an enormous range of actual situations. The tests produced fallout. Residents downwind of the test site, people in southern Utah and Nevada, farmers and ranchers whose families had lived in the region for generations, were exposed to radioactive fallout from the tests in ways that would not become fully understood or acknowledged until decades later. The cancer rates in those communities in the following decades were quietly, devastatingly elevated. In Las Vegas itself, the relationship with the test was more complicated and, frankly, stranger. The city was close enough to see and feel the blasts. Windows rattled, the ground trembled, the sky lit up before dawn, but far enough that the immediate physical effects were less severe than for communities directly downwind. The Atomic Energy Commission had been careful about wind direction when scheduling tests, though careful is doing a lot of work in that sentence as well. The Las Vegas response was, with remarkable consistency, to treat the nuclear testing as an attraction rather than a hazard. The Las Vegas Chamber of Commerce openly promoted the test as a tourist draw. The casinos leaned into it. There were atomic cocktails on the menus, a layered drink served in a mushroom cloud glass, and atomic hairdos in the beauty shops. The Desert Inn sold postcards. The workers at the test site itself, engineers, military personnel, scientists, and a significant number of ordinary workers who did construction, maintenance and support functions, commuted to and from Las Vegas daily. They were not permitted to discuss their work in any detail, and most of them didn't. They ate breakfast at the same diners as the casino workers. Their children went to the same schools. They lived in the same neighborhoods. The test site was the other major employer in the region, and if you worked there and someone asked what you did, you said something vague about government work, and the subject changed. It is one of the odder facts of 1950s Las Vegas that a city defined by artificial light and calculated illusion was also, in its own way, living inside one of the most elaborate illusions the United States government ever constructed. The idea that nuclear testing in the desert was a manageable, containable, perfectly acceptable neighbour. The neon was bright, the drinks were cold, the mushroom cloud was on the horizon, pink and enormous in the early morning sky, and the casinos were already open, and the slots were already running, and nobody, officially, was worried about anything at all. The Las Vegas buffet was not invented in the 1950s, but it was perfected there, or at least perfected to the specific standard of overwhelming and slightly alarming. The origin story traces to Herb McDonald, the entertainment director of the El Rancho Vegas, who in 1946 created something he called the Midnight Chuck Wagon, an all-you-can-eat spread for $1 designed to keep gamblers on the property after the shows ended rather than letting them wander off to sleep. By the 1950s, the buffet had become a cornerstone of Las Vegas hospitality, and every major casino had one. They were remarkable in their ambition and deeply chaotic in their execution. Here was the economic proposition. The casino was giving you food as cheaply as possible in exchange for you staying inside the casino, where you would give them money. The buffet was not a gift. The buffet was a retention strategy. The roast beef was a cover charge. The food itself was the food of mid-century American institutional cooking, which is to say, it was filling, it was recognizable, it was prepared in quantities that required industrial equipment, and it was varying degrees of actually good depending entirely on what time you arrived and how long any given dish had been sitting in its warming tray. The prime rib was the crown jewel of the Las Vegas buffet in the 1950s. It was almost always there, being sliced at a carving station by a man in a tall white hat, and it was almost always reasonably good, because prime rib is difficult to ruin at scale in the way that, say, scrambled eggs are not. Around the prime rib orbited a constellation of side dishes: mashed potatoes, green beans cooked until they had arrived at a colour that was more of a philosophical suggestion of green than an actual green, dinner rolls, a salad of iceberg lettuce and bottled dressing, some form of casserole involving something creamy, and for dessert, a selection of sheet cakes and puddings that were aggressively beige. The price was the revolutionary part. A full buffet dinner at a major strip casino in the 1950s could be had for around $1 to $1.50. This was, by any reasonable calculation, extraordinarily cheap, and the casinos knew it and intended it to be extraordinarily cheap, because the buffet was not a profit centre. It was a loss leader, a calculated sacrifice of food revenue in exchange for keeping bodies in the building. The math worked because the casino floor was right there, and the people who had just eaten $1 worth of prime rib were not getting in their cars. They were staying. And while they stayed, they played. The breakfast buffet deserves its own consideration, because the Las Vegas breakfast buffet in the 1950s was a specific and somewhat confronting experience. It opened early, very early, in some cases never having technically closed from the night before, and it catered to a customer base that fell into roughly two categories: people who had just woken up and wanted breakfast, and people who had not yet been to sleep and wanted breakfast anyway. Both groups stood in the same line, holding the same plate, making the same choices between the scrambled eggs and the pancakes, and if you looked carefully at the second group, you could see in their faces the specific quality of a person who has stopped asking what time it is because the answer has become irrelevant. They ate their eggs, they drank their coffee, they went back to the floor. The buffet had done its job. Away from the buffets and the showrooms, the actual domestic food situation in Las Vegas in the 1950s was slightly more complicated than you might expect. The city was growing so fast in that decade, the population went from about 24,000 in 1950 to over 60,000 by 1960, that the infrastructure for regular civilian life was perpetually struggling to catch up. Grocery stores existed, but for years the selection was limited and sometimes unreliable, because everything had to be shipped into the desert from somewhere else. Fresh produce was a seasonal adventure. The summers were brutal on perishables, and the women running households in Las Vegas in this era were, in a very real sense, doing the exact same job as housewives everywhere in America, managing a family, feeding a household, stretching a budget, except they were doing it in 110-degree heat, with a view of a casino and the occasional ambient rumble of a nuclear detonation in the background. Just your normal Tuesday. The grocery run was a morning activity, non-negotiable. For the same reason everything else was a morning activity. You needed to be done and back inside before the heat made the car into a slow cooker. You loaded your paper bags into the trunk, drove home as briskly as the speed limit allowed, and got the perishables into the refrigerator with a focused urgency that would have seemed dramatic anywhere else but was simply sensible here. Milk left in a hot car for 20 minutes in July was not milk anymore, it was a decision you were going to regret. The Safeway and the Smiths and the smaller independent grocers of 1950s Las Vegas carried the same basic inventory as grocery stores across America: canned goods, dry goods, meat from the butcher counter, dairy, bread. But the fresh produce section was a more limited affair than what you might find in, say, Los Angeles. because trucking produce into the desert in summer required either refrigerated transport, which existed but added cost, or a degree of optimism about the fruit's structural integrity upon arrival that was not always warranted. Experienced Las Vegas housewives learned to manage around this. You cooked with canned tomatoes more than fresh ones. You planned meals around what was actually good rather than what you theoretically wanted. You became, by necessity, extremely good at making do. The kitchen itself was the centre of domestic life in the Las Vegas ranch home, and it was a 1950s American kitchen in every particular linoleum floor, electric range, refrigerator with the rounded corners of the era, a small table and chairs pushed against one wall for family breakfasts. The casserole was the dominant art form. The Jell-O salad was a legitimate side dish. The cookbook of choice was something practical and spiral-bound, full of recipes that called for a can of cream of mushroom soup as a universal binding agent for approximately 40% of American cuisine in this decade. You made your husband's lunch. You made the children's lunch. You made dinner, and dinner was on the table at 6, or close to it, which required a level of logistical precision that nobody ever fully acknowledged was impressive. The Las Vegas housewife of the 1950s occupied the same cultural position as the housewife everywhere in America at that moment, central to the functioning of the household, largely invisible in the broader conversation about what the city was and what made it run. The people who built Las Vegas in this decade were celebrated for their vision and their nerve. The women who kept the households running while the city grew around them were simply doing what women did, which was everything that needed doing and rarely made the newspaper. Dinner was finished. The dishes were washed. The children were in bed. The husband was on the swing shift and wouldn't be home until 2 a.m. Outside, the neon on the horizon was doing what it always did. You sat for a moment in the kitchen with a cup of tea and the particular silence of a house at night, which was not really silence at all, because the desert had its own sounds and the distant city had its own sounds, and somewhere a dog was barking, and in the morning you would do all of it again. This one is not comfortable, but it has to be said because leaving it out would be a lie of omission so large it would collapse under its own weight. The Las Vegas Strip of the 1950s was, in almost every practical sense, racially segregated. The performers were not. The Sands booked Nat King Cole. The Moulin Rouge hosted Sammy Davis Jr., Lena Horne, Pearl Bailey. The casinos brought in black entertainers because black entertainers were, without any debate, some of the finest performers in the country. And then, after the show, those same performers were frequently required to leave through the back entrance, were not permitted to gamble in the casinos where they had just performed, and could not stay in the hotels where their names were on the marquee. Sammy Davis Jr. described having to cross the street after his own shows to stay at a boarding house on the west side, the predominantly black neighborhood of Las Vegas, because no strip hotel would give him a room. He was simultaneously a headliner and a person who could not legally eat in the same dining room as his audience. This was not an accident or an oversight. It was policy, enforced consistently and without apparent discomfort by the casino operators of the era. Nevada had no formal segregation laws on the books in the way that southern states did. There was no legal equivalent of Jim Crow statutes mandating separate facilities. What existed instead was a system of informal, privately enforced discrimination that produced exactly the same results without requiring legislation. Hotel managers simply declined to rent rooms to black guests. Casino floor managers declined to allow black patrons to gamble. Restaurant hostesses declined to seat black diners. None of this was written down anywhere official. It didn't need to be. It was understood by everyone who ran the businesses and by everyone who tried to use them. The workforce was similarly divided, and in ways that were carefully invisible to the tourists. Black workers were employed by the casinos, but in specific roles: kitchen staff, laundry workers, maintenance. The guest-facing positions, the dealers, the front desk clerks, the cocktail waitresses, the showroom staff were white. If you were a black worker in a Las Vegas casino in the 1950s, you worked in the back of the house, and if the guests ever noticed your presence at all, it was in context where you were serving or cleaning. You were not dealing their cards. You were not pouring their complimentary drinks in the showroom. The architecture of the casino, with its careful separation of front-of-house glamour from back-of-house labour, made this easy to maintain and easy to ignore. The performers who experienced this most viscerally were the entertainers whose names sold tickets, but whose bodies were not welcome in the buildings those tickets bought. Harry Belafonte, Lena Horne, Nat King Cole, Billy Eckstine, they performed on the same stages as Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, drew the same crowds, received the same applause, and went home to entirely different accommodations. Some of them spoke about it publicly. Some of them absorbed it as one of the costs of doing business in a country where this was simply how things were. Some of them privately were furious. What makes this particular piece of Las Vegas history genuinely important is not that it was unique. Segregation was practiced across the United States in this era, in countless industries and cities, but that it was so starkly visible alongside the city's mythology of glamour and freedom. Las Vegas sold itself as a place where the normal rules didn't apply, where anyone could come and have the time of their life, where luck and money were the only things that mattered. That mythology coexisted without apparent cognitive dissonance, with a system that excluded an entire portion of the American population from most of what the city offered. The neon shone equally on everyone. The doors did not open equally for everyone. That contradiction sat at the heart of 1950s, Las Vegas like a stone, and the city would spend the following decades slowly, imperfectly, incompletely reckoning with it. While the Strip glittered under its neon and the white suburbs of Paradise Valley filled with ranch houses and backyard barbecues, there existed another Las Vegas entirely, one that never appeared in the tourism photographs but was just as real, just as alive, and in many ways just as remarkable. The West Side, located just across the railroad tracks from downtown Las Vegas, was the city's predominantly black neighborhood, and it was where the musicians, entertainers, cooks, and service workers who kept the Strip running actually lived. By the mid-1950s, the West Side had its own restaurants, its own clubs, its own economy, and its own singular culture, shaped in large part by the fact that some of the greatest jazz and blues musicians in America passed through regularly, stayed in the neighborhood's boarding houses and small hotels, and played late-night sets at clubs like the Town Tavern and the El Morocco after finishing their Strip engagements. If you wanted to hear what the musicians actually played when they weren't performing for tourists, the West Side is where you went. The neighborhood was not wealthy. The housing stock was modest, older, and less well-maintained than the new subdivisions going up in other parts of the city, a disparity that was directly connected to the fact that black residents were excluded from purchasing homes in those new subdivisions through a combination of restrictive covenants, discriminatory lending practices, and real estate agents who simply declined to show properties in certain areas to black buyers. This was not unique to Las Vegas. It was standard practice in American real estate in this era, implemented through private agreements rather than law, and producing residential segregation as effectively as any statute could have. The West Side was where black Las Vegas residents lived because it was, in most practical senses, where they were permitted to live. Within those constraints, the community built something genuine. The churches were anchors, Baptist and AME congregations that provided not just spiritual life, but community organization, social support, and a civic infrastructure that the neighborhood could rely on. The schools educated the children of West Side families, and they were, like most black schools in segregated American cities, staffed by qualified teachers working in facilities that received less funding than the schools across town. The disparity was real and visible and officially unacknowledged, but the music was the thing that made the West Side of 1950s Las Vegas something more than simply a neighborhood where people had been pushed by circumstance. When Sammy Davis Jr. finished his show at the Sands at